There's a fascinating body of research in the United States that looked at what is it that parents most value in raising children. And they'd ask them, like, the top Hall of Fame dreams they have for their children. This study started in 1920. From 1920 to 1980, raising obedient children was at the top of the list, 1920 to 1980. From 1980 on, raising obedient children gradually fell off the list. Today it's nowhere even in the top 10. There's been a sea change in terms of the balance between love and limits. Our rabbis tell us that the ideal in terms of raising children is to find the balance between love and limits. We know that is a core rabbinic finding 3 times in the Talmud. They say that, the key to raising children is to push away with the left hand while you bring closer with the right hand. Smol doche v'imim mekareves. Interestingly, psychological research says the same thing. There's 3 kinds of parenting in a simplistic way. There's, on one end, overindulgent. Those are the right-hand specialists, imim mekareves specialists, people who never say no. Okay? If you never say no to a child, you raise a child who's overindulged, spoiled, and not prepared for life. It's a disaster. And they're not prepared for marriage, they're not prepared for work. It's just not a way to raise a child. If you go to the other extreme, called authoritarian parenting, where it's all rules, no limits, that's no good either. Rules without relationships equals rebellion. Psychology tells us you want to go for the middle. It's called authoritative parenting. And it's the balance between, on the one hand, loving your child, making him or her feel that there's nothing that they could do that'll lead to the loss of your love, but at the same time containing them with a clear set of rules and structure. So that's the basic theme of the talk. Now for the first story, okay? Smol doche v'imim mekareves, right? Remember that imagery I said? There's the rabbi who was a well-known parenting expert in California. His name was Rabbi Simcha Wasserman. His father was the well-known rabbinic giant, Rabbi Elchanan Wasserman, who was very well known to some people in this audience. Was killed by the Nazis even though he was safe in America, didn't have to go back. But he insisted on going back to certain death because he wanted to lead his congregation through the horrible times of the Nazi extermination. But his son survived. His son never had children of his own and became a brilliant educator and parenting expert in California. He had a yeshiva. He had a dormitory yeshiva high school. And he was known to turn kids around. He was like an amazing, amazing educator. And he famously said, Rabbi Simcha Wasserman, what happens if you put into play what the Talmud tells us? Okay? So you could try it with your children when you get home. You take a child and you simultaneously push him or her away with your left hand while you bring them closer with your right hand. You could try it. You know what happens literally? You turn them around. It's a nice imagery, right? And that's exactly what the Talmud is telling us. And it's exactly what psychological research is telling us. So I said this over at a parenting lecture I gave. And in the audience was a well-known New York rabbi. And he came over to me and he said, it's interesting you're talking about this and about Rabbi Wasserman because I'm a graduate of his yeshiva and I really knew him. And he epitomized this balance between love and limits. But he said, I have a great story for you. He told me he went to Rabbi Wasserman's dormitory yeshiva in Beverly Hills, California. He said the rule in the dormitory was that the boys had to make their beds every morning before going off to a long day of classes, both in Judaic studies and general studies. They'd come back late at night. And he said he was about 15 years old, and of course he and his roommate never made their beds. What 15-year-old boy makes his bed? I don't know if that happens in South Africa. Okay, it's probably no different here. Okay. I always have teenagers in my office and my practice who will scream and yell and say, all my friends are allowed to do this, or all my friends are allowed to do that. So I told some of my patients before I left for here that I've yet to meet that friend, but maybe he lives in South Africa. So I'm looking. If anybody knows him, let me know. Come see me after the talk. So he tells me the following story. Of course, he never made his bed. When he was 15 years old, his roommate never made his bed. And one day, after a long day of school, they'd come back at about 10 o'clock at night. It was a pretty grueling schedule in these yeshiva high schools. He opens the door to his room, and he's convinced that some kind of very strange burglar broke in, because his bed is made like professionally. Hospital corners. It's made like by a professional. And his roommate's bed is made just as professionally. So he tells his roommate, I'm not going in this room. And his roommate looks up and says, I'm not going. And there's some burglar probably hiding somewhere in the closet or something. And finally, he gets up enough courage to walk into the room. And he sees on his bed, on his pillow, and his roommate on his pillow, 5 beautifully handwritten words. Beds made by Simcha Wasserman. He said Rabbi Wasserman never said a word to him, never criticized him, never even gave him a dirty look. But for the rest of his high school career, he made his bed and his roommate made his bed. Nice story. Except I told this story over to a parenting group in Beverly Hills about a year ago. And I told over the story, and the principal of a local yeshiva high school comes over to me afterwards, and she said, I knew Rabbi Wasserman. I grew up here in Beverly Hills, and he was exactly like that. Everything you said is exactly accurate. He was a master educator, knew how to find that balance between love and limits. He was a genius. She said, but I have a question to ask you before you get on the plane back to New York. She says, you don't have to give me the answer now. I want you to think about it. She said, what would happen if the same story happened today? This was in 2011. Let's say the exact same story happened in a dormitory in Beverly Hills today. Now, I don't know about South Africa, and I didn't know what to answer. I said, I want to think about it. The next week, there was a mandatory parenting program at a large yeshiva high school in the New York metropolitan area. It was a program, they have mandatory parenting programs there. You have to go to them, or else you can't enroll your kid in school the next year. They say you have to go to 3. As a matter of fact, my daughter who's here, my youngest, she went to Yeshiva High School for girls, Yeshiva University High School for girls, and the rule there was there were 3 mandatory parenting programs. I was a parent in the school. They figured they'd ask me to do it. They had a freebie. They have a parent. So they asked me to do these 3 parenting lectures. I did the first one, and I get a letter in the mail 2 days later. Dear Dr. and Mrs. Pelcowitz, this is to tell you that you missed a wonderful parenting lecture by Dr. David Pelcowitz. You can't enroll Ronit in class in the school next year if you don't come to the 2 lectures that Dr. Pelcowitz will be giving in the remainder of the school year. And it was signed by them, and I called them up and I said, how did you know I wasn't paying attention to a word I said? Okay? Anyway, true story. Still have it hanging on the bulletin board in my house. This is one of these mandatory lectures for a large yeshiva high school in the Brooklyn area, actually it was in New York City. So I figure I have a captive audience, hundreds and hundreds of parents. So I told them the story about what had just happened in Beverly Hills the week before. And I said, by show of hands, How many of you here think your children would have made their beds for the rest of their high school career if they found a note like that? 2 people raised their hand. Then I asked, maybe they weren't paying attention, how many of you think that your children would not have made their beds for more than maybe a couple of days at the most, if at all? About 500 hands go up, okay? So it's a pretty powerful change that the research is showing, my personal experience is showing. I don't know if that's happening here as well. We're in the balance between love and limits. We've all become right-hand specialists, love specialists, and we're uncomfortable with giving our children no's, with the limit-setting part of parenting. And yet the reality is that without frustrating our children at times, they can't grow. They can't. We could construct a world for our kids when they're very young where they never have to experience any frustration whatsoever. It would actually be an unqualified disaster. They wouldn't be able to function in life. It's interesting. There's a fascinating medrash on a passage in Mishlei, in Proverbs. I want to share it with you. And then I want to tell you a story, or actually sort of what I'm seeing in my office in a similar vein. It says the following. It says in Proverbs, Yaser bincha ki yesh tikva ve'el hamiso al tite nafshecha. Put limits on your children. There's always hope. And don't pay attention to their yelling and screaming. Okay? Here's what the Medrash says. When you hear it, it falls on our ears as very strange. It says the following. Kol hamosif av yisurim al beno. The more a father, the more a parent puts limits on his child, Mosif haben ahava al aviv. The more that child will love that parent. Now you may say, oh, come on. When you punish your kids or discipline your kids, they don't respond with love. They give you a hard time. They go nuts on you, okay? But the reality is you have to look at the bigger picture. 3 to 4 times in my practice, and it's probably happened more than this, I've had kids in my office in adolescence who were rebelling and very upset at their parents putting limits on them, and they'd go nuts. And then I've been in practice long enough to be into the next generation, well into the next generation. I'll see those former adolescents when they're parents of kids. And on 3 occasions, spontaneously, these now adults told me, remember I'd have a tantrum in your office because my parents took away my credit card, or I had a tantrum in your office because I wasn't allowed out on school nights, or my parents didn't let me go into Midtown Manhattan to clubs, or whatever it was they said no to. Deep down, they tell me, I was happy that they said no. It's a new phenomenon in New York. Children, when they come back from studying for a year or 2 in Israel, they're angry at their parents because their parents allowed them to do so much when they were in high school. They say, why did you let me do that? You know, I knew that there was a sea change in this problem when I got a phone call from the principal of a well-known New York City yeshiva preschool. And it was a panicked phone call. He says, Dave, you got to call me back. And he keeps calling me nonstop all day. He says, it's an emergency. Call me back, call me back, call me back. I call him back. He says, I want to book you for 5 parenting lectures for my school. And I you know, it's certainly something that I didn't understand. Usually it's 1 parenting lecture. In the case of my daughter, 3 parenting lectures. But 5 parenting lectures, what do you want? He said, let me tell you what happened today. He says, I want you to just do it on parenting because things are going nuts. He said, I want you to do it on values. I said, what happened? He said he came to work that morning. It was the Monday morning. And there were like 20 angry phone calls from the parents of the preschool class of 5-year-olds. Because what had happened the day before on Sunday is a 5-year-old had his 5-year-old birthday party in Midtown Manhattan. It was in a Midtown Manhattan nightclub, disco nightclub, and they hired a DJ with dancing. Okay, the kind of thing that you wouldn't let a high school kid do, the kind of thing you wouldn't want to do as an adult necessarily, okay? But certainly not the kind of thing that you would let a kindergarten kid do. So parents were furious, and they called the principal up. The principal called the mother and said, "What were you thinking that you had a disco party with the DJ for a 5-year-old kid?" And she said, "But he asked." Okay? And he said, "Wow, we have a lot of work to do." And the reality is that's been the sea change. So take-home message number one, it's not a surprising take-home message, is no is essential for child development. When you do limit setting, the ideal limits for kids, certainly when they get a little bit older, like even pre-adolescence and adolescence, is there are 3 kinds of limits that tend to be associated with kids internalizing our values. One is the limits need to be developed, need to be put on the kid calmly, without high levels of yelling, screaming, and criticism. If you have to have a consequence, it should be rational. It should stem from the misbehavior. A midah keneged midah, right? You, I don't know, stayed out late on a weekend night and came out late. It means you're grounded for the next week or whatever it might be. And the third is it shouldn't be too long. There's a repeated saying in the Talmud, tafasta meruba lo tafasta, tafasta miyuta tafasta. You go for too much, you get nothing. You go for a little, that's when you gain. And that's the third component of limit setting. Let me end this limit setting section with a story from my practice a while ago. There was a kid, must have been about 16, came from a wonderful, wonderful family. But they were right-hand specialists. They were love specialists. They did not know how to say no. And he was a kid with a temperament. He was going a little wild. He was staying out late on school nights. He wasn't doing well. He upped the ante. They still weren't putting limits on him. And I was getting worried because he was beginning to turn to drugs. He was like really a little out of control. So I called the parents in and him together in a joint session. And he agreed to it. And I said, guys, you know, maybe we should talk about some changes in the rules at home. So his father realized and his mother realized, they have to start putting their foot down in terms of limit setting. They were getting nervous also. So the father says, look, first thing, I'm taking away your credit cards. Next thing, you can't go out on a school night. Next thing is even on weekends, unless we have evidence you've done all your homework, you can't go. It's going on. And the kid is getting angrier and angrier, and his face is turning red. And at a certain point, he's getting out of his chair, and it looks like he's going to physically attack his father. And I get nervous. I asked him to leave the room. I'm sorry, I asked his parents to leave the room while he waited in my office. And they go in the waiting room, and he waits till he's sure that they're out of earshot. He then calls me over, and he whispers in my ear, "It's about time." Isn't that amazing? It's about time. And that's what I'm seeing. Kids, more and more, at least in this generation in the United States, are reacting to the total discomfort that many of their parents have on limit setting. They're comfortable with flexible limits that have the 3 characteristics I talked about. So that's part 1. Okay? We're okay with that? Okay. Part 2 has to do, let's talk a little bit about the love side. Okay, we'll talk a little bit. I know you've heard in other talks here the idea that there's a connection between the amount of time a parent spends with their child and the child's ability to internalize parental values. We know, for example, that every night a week the parents have dinner with their child. There's correspondingly lower levels of substance abuse. Some research done at Columbia University, the statistics are pretty striking, so that it goes like this. So compared to those teens who have family dinners twice a week or less, teens who have dinner with their families 5 or more nights a week are 32% likelier never to have tried cigarettes, 45% likelier never to have tried alcohol, 24% likelier never to have smoked marijuana, and it goes on. It really is something that makes sense, because when you have that kind of monitoring in the context of a good relationship and that kind of daily checking, and by the way, this isn't having dinner with the television set on in the background. This is having dinner where you don't take cell phone calls and you're really there for your child without interruptions. Just think of what the nonverbal is when your cell phone rings and you're talking to your child and you say, wait a second, excuse me, and you turn back to take the call. What's the message? The message is that whoever this stranger is, or it could be somebody who's not a stranger, whoever's calling you is more important than your child is to you. The time issue is an extremely important time. To be able to steal time, to be able to find time with your children, even if it means taking them shopping with you, even if it means taking them on business trips with you, to be able to do that makes all the difference in the world, even in your busy lives. You know, there's always 10 minutes to steal with your kids a couple of times a week where you sit with them and you check in with them. It's a protection against a whole host of problems, and to show them that this doesn't take precedence over them. Let me tell you a story. I gave a talk in Jerusalem on a similar topic. And in the audience was the closest friend of the son of Rabbi Bloch. I know in this neighborhood, many of you know about Rabbi Gifter, who was the head of Telz Yeshiva in Cleveland. So his predecessor was a well-known rabbi who ran Telz Yeshiva, Rabbi Bloch. And this is the story I heard about Rabbi Bloch's son told his best friend. His father was extremely busy, had a very high-powered career, never had time to be alone with his kid, except that every morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, he would, wearing his bathrobe, show up at his son's door. I don't know if he was wearing his bathrobe. I don't remember exactly what I was told. But he'd show, maybe he was wearing a suit and a tie. I don't know. But he'd show up at his son's door. His son in his pajamas would come out of bed. They'd go to the kitchen table and sit down and have tea and milk together for the 45 minutes before his father went to Shacharis, went to daven. And they would talk about their day. Father would talk about the previous day. He'd ask his son about his previous day. They'd talk about the coming day. It was the highlight of his son's day. And it forged exactly the kind of relationship that leads to internalization of values. There's a magnificent Kutzker on a passage at the end of Tehillim, at the end of Psalms, talking about raising children. And it says the following. It says, "Kachitzim biyad gibar kain b'nei hanaurim." Raising children is like being an archer. So the Kutzker asks, what's the connection between being an archer and raising children? There's no obvious connection. But he answers the following. He says, just like an archer, the closer he holds the bow to his heart, the further and straighter the arrow goes. So too with raising our children, the closer we hold them to our heart, the further and straighter they go. That's the time dimension. I can't emphasize it enough. I really can't. And we have to think about it. We have to think about how our children will remember us. They know when we're prioritizing them. And again, we're really talking about stealing the time, them knowing that you'd like nothing better than to be able to really check in with them on a regular basis. Okay? And by the way, certain age, they don't want to be caught dead with you. Okay? They don't want to have anything to do with you. There's a wonderful best-selling parenting book in the United States called Mom, Would You Get Out of My Life, But First Would You Take Me and Cheryl to the Mall? Which kind of captures the essence of the ambivalence of adolescence. At a certain point, they don't want to be with you. They really don't. But ultimately, they get to the point that you have to understand that even though they're acting like they don't want to be with you, if you wake them up in the middle of the night and say, if you had a big problem, who's the first person you would go to? It's usually the parent. And they value your input, even in adolescence, more than you can know. I want to talk a little bit about invisible modeling before I get to my concluding story. And I know this is obvious. It's been a theme. Those of you who've been at the 4 or 5 talks I gave earlier this week and the 2 previous talks today, but it's been a theme certainly over Shabbos when I gave any talk related to parenting, is a lot of what we teach our kids is when we're not even aware of it. It's how honest we are when we don't even know they're watching. It's how a husband treats a wife or a wife treats a husband. And it's in general our approach. It's the way kids pick this up. It's with the right hemisphere. It's the nonverbal language that's the key to what kids pick up. There's a new literature coming out on something called priming. This is just to tell you one example of the power of invisible modeling. Then I'm going to read to you a couple of brief things. Here's what it says. It says that it's a book written by a Dr. Kahneman. This is a neighborhood that knows the name Kahneman, because Kahneman is the name of the Panovitcher Rebbe. It's a real force in this neighborhood. I was very lucky growing up when Rabbi Kahneman, the Panovitcher Rebbe, used to come to New York many, many years ago. He had a son in my neighborhood who lived in cramped quarters, and he used to stay at my house. So I grew up, not appreciated at the time. I used to sit on his lap and learn Chumash when I was a little 4 or 5-year-old kid, and I grew up listening to his brilliant words. He had a nephew. This nephew won the Nobel Prize in Economics. If you knew Rabbi Kahneman, you knew that, it's an apple that doesn't fall far from the tree. I understand that he has a nephew here in South Africa. But this nephew was a world-renowned psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in Economics. He wrote a wonderful book called Think Fast, Think Slow. It's a brilliant book. One of the things he talks about is how easily we impact on our children, on our friends, without even knowing it. Because there's a part of the brain that absorbs nonverbal lessons. I talked about this a little bit to some of you on Shabbos when I gave some examples of this, but priming I'm saving for now. Here's the priming research. He gives, for example, 5 unrelated words to groups of 5 people. Let's say I divided this group into 5 people, 5 people, 5 people, 5 people. And I gave you each a list of 5 words to memorize. And then we have you walk to the hall outside, and you'll be tested on your memory and the spelling for those words. Okay? That's what happens. Okay? So the words are unrelated, but unbeknownst to one group in this room, you get the following 5 words: gray, wrinkled, retired, Florida, and shuffleboard. 2 American references to where older people go to retire and a game they love to play, shuffleboard. Okay? So it's 5 words tied to old age. You ostensibly don't even know those 5 words are tied to old age, although you'll probably figure it out, but you certainly wouldn't think it would have an impact on you. Then you walk out of the room to be tested on your 5 words, and we time how long it takes for you to get to the hall. Do you know that the people who get the 5 old person words will take at least twice as long to get to the hall? And if you ask them, why are you walking so slow? They say, no, I'm not walking so slow. Because that's the subtle ways that we influence our children. Listen to this Tolstoy short story. It'll take about anywhere from 45 to 50 minutes. It's Tolstoy. That's the War and Peace guy. You ready? Here we go. Tolstoy's short story. The grandfather had become very old. His legs wouldn't go. His eyes didn't see. His ears didn't hear. He had no teeth. And when he ate, the food dripped from his mouth. The son and daughter-in-law stopped setting a place for him at the table and gave him supper in back of the stove. Once, they brought dinner to him in a cup. The old man wanted to move the cup and dropped and broke it. The daughter-in-law began to grumble at the old man for spoiling everything in the house and breaking the cups, and said that she would now give him dinner in a dishpan. The old man only sighed and said nothing. Once, the husband and wife were staying at home and watching their small son playing on the floor with some wooden planks. He was building something. Father asked, "What is it that you're doing, Misha?" Misha said, "Dear father, I'm making a dishpan so that when you and dear mother become old, you may be fed from this dishpan." The husband and wife looked at one another and began to weep. They became ashamed of so offending the old man, and from then on, seated him at the table and waited on him. That's modeling. So let's review the ingredients I gave you, and then I'll do the concluding story. We talked about the balance between love and limits. We talked about the need to turn children around by finding that balance. The dangers of all love or all limits. We talked about rules without relationships equals rebellion if it's all limits, and about all love leading to overindulgence. We talked about the sea change in many societies across the world where we're more comfortable with limits, with love than with limits, and the need to get more comfortable with hearing our children be upset, because that's fine, it's part of growth. And then we talked about invisible modeling, but ultimately, it's also about paying attention to your child's unique temperament. As I've said earlier this weekend, the idea of the nigun miyuchad, every child having a unique melody that we have to bring out in them. And I'm going to end with a story. There's a child, 16-year-old boy, going to a yeshiva high school in the United States. And he was a troubled kid. And the second Shabbos was over, he runs to the main block of his town where the stores are, goes down some steps, and he lights up a marijuana cigarette. The head of his yeshiva takes Shabbos out a little later. He waits 72 minutes. And he's walking home, going by this street. He smells the marijuana and recognizes it. Now, by the way, why he recognized it is another question, okay? And he looks down and sees one of his students getting high. This is like a serious yeshiva, kicks the kid out of the school, zero tolerance policy. Nobody knows about it except the principal, who was walking home. So the parents pick up the phone, they call me, they say, "You got to help our kid. If he's kicked out of this school, he's going to go downhill fast." I call the principal, I say, "Listen, give me a break. I'll give the kid a drug test once a month. I'll fax it into your private fax number. I'll call you with a weekly psychotherapy report about how the kid is doing. It won't affect the reputation of your school. Nobody knows about it. Let me see him." And I wore the guy down. He said, "Fine." Okay, seeing the kid for a couple of weeks. And as I'm seeing him more and more, it becomes clear to me there are two reasons why kids do drugs, to be simplistic. It's to feel good or to feel better. That's a very simplistic statement. He was doing it to feel better. He was self-medicating a depression. He came from a family whose bumper sticker was Ivy League or die. Everybody in that family needed to do well in school, and the dream was that every kid would get into a top university in the United States, and all of the older siblings were brilliant and were getting into these top universities. This was the younger brother. He was not feeling terribly competent because he had an undiagnosed attention deficit. I diagnosed that he had an undiagnosed learning disability and accompanying attention deficit. And he was growing up feeling that he was constantly disappointing his parents, became depressed and self-medicated. So I was seeing him, he still wasn't getting better because he still felt the disappointment reflecting back to him every time his parents saw him. He felt he couldn't make anybody in his family happy. He just felt like a big failure in life at age 15, 16. So I asked him, "Does anybody get you? Does anybody in your family understand you?" He said, "Yeah, my grandfather. My mother's father understands me." So I said, "Can we have a session? We'll have your mother's father come in and your parents, and we'll talk it out. Sometimes when a grandparent gets a kid, they could help me also." So I called the grandfather in, and I had permission to tell him the story of what happened to his grandson. It turns out the grandfather is running the business that's paying these huge Ivy League tuitions, $50,000 a year plus, to send a kid to a top university in the United States. So, very wealthy guy. He's supporting the whole extended family, and he hears about this grandson and this grandson's problem. This grandson, by the way, was terrible in school, but he was very street smart. Very street smart. Just wasn't book smart. And he immediately gets furious, and he turns to his daughter and his son-in-law, and he says, "You never told this boy why this family exists? You never told him about my story?" And he turns to his grandson, he says, "Let me tell you about my story." He said, "I was your age. I was exactly like you. I also had older siblings who were superstars, but I was good at seeing patterns, hidden patterns, and I saw Hitler was going to kill us all. I was growing up in Europe. My older siblings were married, very successful in what they were doing, greatly successful in academic areas. But I saw that Hitler and the Nazis were closing in on us, and I begged my parents, let's get out of here while we can. And they just totally ignored me." And he turns to me, he says that they believed in psychologists back then, they would have schlepped me to a guy like this. A little dig for me, okay? And then he turns to his daughter and his son-in-law with tears in his eyes. He says, "You know what happened? Every one of them was killed. I got away just in the nick of time. I started a business that's supporting everybody in the family. It's because I have the soul and the spark of this boy. That's why. It's because I have exactly this kind of style and this kind of temperament. Everybody's gone. My brothers, my sisters, my parents, they all were killed by the Nazis." And he turns to his daughter and he says, "If you can't make room for this kind of soul, I don't have anything to do with you." And he gets up, slams the door of my office, drives away. I never see him again. But what's left in my office is 3 people crying. The mother, the father, the son. And you could almost see their bumper sticker expanding to let in this kind of a child. The end of the story, my wife sometimes says I shouldn't say because it sounds like I made it up, but it's true, so I have to tell you the truth. What ended up happening, this happened about maybe 20 years ago. Today, this young man, now a middle-aged man, is, well, not quite middle-aged, but getting there, is running the business very successfully, and his older siblings are all working for him. Okay? Thank you. Okay?